Okay, so you've probably heard this name before, especially lately. Yevgeny Prigozhin.
Yeah, he's been in the news a lot.
But we're doing a deep dive today, getting beyond just the headlines, because this guy, he was more than just like a wealthy businessman, even though he was definitely that.
Right. A lot more to him than meets the eye.
Catering was a big part of it, sure, but then you get into all this other stuff.
Yeah,
Election meddling, a private army. It's wild.
it really is. His story reads like, well, honestly, it's like a spy thriller or something. But the crazy thing is, it's all real.
Exactly. So, where do we even begin with someone like this? I mean, to understand how he got to that level of power, we got to go back, right?
Absolutely. We need to start with his roots. Prigozhin's early life, back in Soviet-era Leningrad, that's key. It's St. Petersburg now, but back then it was Leningrad.
Okay, so we're talking about a guy who went from, what, like selling hot dogs on the street to catering for Putin himself.
You got it. Quite a journey.
Seriously, that's a massive leap. How does that even happen?
Well, think about Russia in the 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapses, it's like total chaos. Wild West almost. Privatization was happening super fast.
So stuff that used to be owned by the government was suddenly up for grabs.
Exactly. And in that kind of environment, anyone with ambition, some street smarts, maybe a little ruthlessness, they could thrive.
And Prigozhin was that guy. He had the drive to grab those opportunities.
Oh, absolutely. He fit right in.
Okay, so hot dogs to high society events. And eventually he gets this nickname, Putin's chef. That's got to be about more than just the food, right?
You're telling me. It suggests a level of closeness, access to Putin, that most people couldn't even imagine.
And his catering company, Concord Catering, wasn't just about those fancy dinners, was it?
Nope, not just that. Prigozhin, through Concord, landed these huge government contracts. He was providing food for the military for all kinds of state institutions.
Wait, so he's feeding the whole Russian military?
Basically, yeah. And think about that for a second.
Hmm.
It's not just making a few meals, it's a massive operation. Millions of dollars involved.
And that puts you in direct contact with some pretty important people, I bet.
You bet it does. That's how catering, something that seems so, I don't know, ordinary, becomes a path to real power.
It's like he catered his way into Russia's inner circle. But do we know for sure if he and Putin were, like, actually friends? Or was it more just business, a transactional kind of thing?
Honestly, there's a lot of speculation out there,
Yeah.
but hard proof about their relationship, that's pretty hard to come by.
So it's still a bit of a mystery.
Kind of, yeah. But what we do know for sure is that the catering, that was real, that connection was undeniable. And it opened doors for Prigozhin, led him to some other ventures, things that were a lot more, well, let's say shadowy.
Which brings us to the Wagner Group. They've been all over the news, a private military company. It almost sounds like something out of a movie.
Right. How do you go from catering to running a private army?
Exactly. Was there some specific event, or was this just the natural progression for someone like him?
It's definitely a dramatic shift, you have to admit. The Wagner Group, basically, they're mercenaries.
Yeah.
Highly trained, but operating outside the normal military structure.
So a proxy force, then. They can do the dirty work, and whoever's hired them can stay out of it.
You got it. Plausible deniability, that's what it's all about.
Mm-hmm.
Governments can use groups like Wagner to get what they want without having to send in their own troops officially. Less risk if things go bad.
So in theory, they could, like, interfere in some conflict and then just say, oh, it wasn't us. That was just some private company doing their own thing.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
But what makes Wagner so interesting, I mean, kind of scary too, is how widespread their operations are. They've been active in Syria, Ukraine, Libya, the Central African Republic. We're talking global reach here.
And we can't forget about the allegations of election meddling, like what happened in the U.S. in 2016 with all the talk about online interference and fake news.
Right, that connects back to Prigozhin, too. There's this organization, the Internet Research Agency, the IRA. They were behind a lot of that stuff, and Prigozhin's linked to them.
And they weren't just like some random trolls posting memes, right?
No, this was organized. Sophisticated campaigns designed to spread disinformation, manipulate what people were seeing on social media.
That's messed up, man. We're not talking about harmless pranks here. This is about potentially swaying elections, undermining democracy. And to think, it all goes back to a guy who started out selling hot dogs.
It really makes you think. Seemingly unconnected events and individuals, they can have huge consequences, especially in today's world where everything's so interconnected.
Okay, so we've got this guy, started with hot dogs, ends up being called Putin's chef, has this private army meddling in U.S. elections, and then you get to the war in Ukraine. But now he's not just behind the scenes anymore. Prigozhin's out there, very public, being super outspoken. What happened?
Well, Wagner being involved in Ukraine, that's a big part of it. They were right in the thick of it, some of the most brutal fighting, so that put Prigozhin in the spotlight. But there's more to it. I think it kind of emboldened him, made him willing to take a risk.
What do you mean by a risk?
He started criticizing Russia's military leaders publicly. Imagine that, taking on the establishment like that, even though he was still supporting the war itself. It was bold. Got to give him that.
Wow, so playing a dangerous game there. And speaking of dangerous, we can't talk about Prigozhin without talking about, well, how he died. August 23rd, 2023, plane crash. Seems straightforward, but the timing with everything else going on.
Yeah, you can't help but think, wait a minute, it's like a scene from a spy movie or something.
Yeah.
Remember how he was criticizing the military? Well, just before that crash, he led this mutiny against them. Lasted a couple days, then fizzled out. But the timing, it's just too suspicious.
So most people assume, what, foul play, but officially it's still just an accident,
Or
right?
actually, no proof's been presented, at least not publicly. But the circumstances, yeah, you got to admit, it's all very fishy. Just adds another layer of mystery to this guy's life, even in death.
Seriously. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. Started with hot dogs, ended up with global power plays, intrigue. It's clear Prigozhin's story. It's bigger than just one man. Feels like we're seeing how power really works in Russia.
Yeah, it's a glimpse behind the curtain for sure.
Yeah.
You see how blurry the lines are between business, politics, and military force in Russia. It's not all neat and separate like it is in some countries.
You can really see that blurring in how he built his empire. Starts with catering, but then those government contracts, feeding the military.
Yeah.
That wasn't just about profit.
You got it. That was about leverage, getting a foothold in the system. From there, he could branch out, using those connections from the catering to do other things, some a lot more controversial.
Like the Wagner Group.
Mm.
Fascinating, but also kind of terrifying. A private army, but with this global reach, messing with conflicts all over.
And that's what makes Prigozhin's legacy so tough to figure out. On one hand, he's this loyalist, supporting Putin's goals. Wagner becomes a tool for Russia, a way to throw their weight around without officially getting involved.
But then he turns around and criticizes the system, right? Takes on the military, especially as the war in Ukraine drags on. Seemed like he didn't care who he pissed off, as long as he could speak his mind.
It's weird, right? He's both an insider and an outsider at the same time. He benefits from the system, even takes advantage of it, but then he also turns around and challenges it from the inside.
So what does all this mean for Russia going forward? What happens to Wagner without Prigozhin at the helm?
That's the big question, isn't it? Wagner's become a major part of how Russia does things on the world stage. They're not just going to disappear overnight.
Right. They represent a big investment, this whole network of influence. Hard to just walk away from that. But with Prigozhin gone, what's next? Do they even have a future?
Well, it's unlikely they'll completely vanish. Some folks think parts of Wagner will get absorbed into the regular Russian military. Others think they'll keep operating, but with the Kremlin keeping them on a much shorter leash.
So a mix of both, maybe.
Probably. And it's not just about the soldiers on the ground either. It's about the networks they've built up, the funding, the political ties that Prigozhin spent years creating. That stuff doesn't go away easily.
So Prigozhin's death, it's more than just the end of one guy. It's a turning point. The things he started, how he changed how Russia uses its power, those things will have consequences for a long time.
Exactly. Okay, let's shift gears for a second and talk to you directly, the listener. Why should you care about all this? It might seem far away, but it's connected to a lot of what's happening in the world today.
Definitely.
Prigozhin's story shows us how complex and interconnected everything is. Stuff that happens in Russia, it doesn't stay there. His actions had global consequences, whether it's election meddling or conflicts on multiple continents.
And he's a perfect example of this trend we're seeing. Private military companies operating in the shadows, doing whatever they want with almost no accountability. They're involved in wars all over the place, and what they do matters.
It's a sign of how things are changing. You know, the old ideas about how countries use their power, they're not working the same way anymore. Private groups, they have more influence than ever before.
So when we're reading the news, watching what's happening, we gotta look beyond the headlines, try to understand what's really going on. Who are the players? What are they trying to do? What are the connections? It helps us make sense of it all.
Exactly. And Yevgeny Prigozhin, for all his contradictions, all the messed up stuff he did, he gives us a glimpse into how power works in the 21st century. It's not pretty, but it's important to see.
His rise and fall, it raises all these questions about what's next for Russia, their place in the world, how they're going to try to use their power going forward. These are things we're going to keep talking about as this all plays out.
And as we dig deeper into the world Prigozhin was part of, we're going to find even more connections, more insights into the forces shaping everything. It goes way deeper than you'd think. Sometimes the smallest detail can be the key to understanding the big picture.
We'll be back in just a minute with some final thoughts for you to chew on.
And we're back. I gotta say, even after all that, I'm still kind of processing everything we learned about Prigozhin. It's like one of those, investigations where you need a giant wall with pictures and notes and red string connecting it all.
I know what you mean. It's a tangled web, for sure. But that's part of what makes it so interesting, right? Prigozhin, he's a real-life example of how power works behind the scenes, all those hidden levers and stuff.
And it's not just some history lesson either. The things he represents, the private armies, the disinformation, how business and politics get all mixed up, that stuff's happening right now, shaping the world we live in.
No doubt about it. Something we all need to pay attention to, whether we're like experts in international relations or just trying to figure out what's going on in the news.
So, knowing all this, what can our listeners even do? Besides maybe feeling overwhelmed by how crazy it all is? Well, awareness is the first step, and you're already doing that by listening to this deep dive. You've got a good grasp of the key players now, what they were after, and how their actions can have these ripple effects. That's a big advantage.
It's like we've been given this decoder ring to understand the news in a deeper way.
Exactly. Now it's about staying informed, questioning what you see and hear, looking for those connections. There's so many threads to unravel with Prigozhin.
I like that threads to unravel. It's not about having all the answers right away. It's about asking the right questions. And Prigozhin's story brings up a lot of them. What happens to Wagner now? What does his death mean for Russia? How will they act on the world stage now?
Those are all great questions, and honestly, no one has all the answers yet. It's still playing out. But having this context, this understanding of the history and the power dynamics, it'll help you analyze what happens next, make sense of the news as it keeps coming.
That's really what the deep dive is all about. We want to give you the knowledge to think for yourself, to understand a complicated world. Sometimes it feels like it's getting more complicated every day.
I agree, but knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
But the more we understand the forces at play, the better we can navigate them.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Putin's chef turned warlord, what's the one big takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
Pay attention to the details. The stuff that might seem small, insignificant, like, remember, the hot dog stands, those catering contracts. Those little things can be the key to understanding these huge networks of power and influence. Keep your eyes open, be curious, don't be afraid to ask the tough questions. That's how we learn and grow.
Great advice. And that's it for our deep dive into the world of Yevgeny Prigozhin. We hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to check out the show notes for more information and links to some of the sources we used. And until next time, stay curious, keep digging, and never stop learning.